So when I fix shoes, the door.
So when I sit on here, you're not gonna do it.
It's 6:30, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening. My name is Annette Mills, and on behalf of the League of Women Voters of Corvallis, I would like to welcome you here tonight's program. We'd also like to thank our co-sponsors, the Land Use Action Team of the Corvallis Sustainability Coalition, Corvallis Benton County Library, and the City of Corvallis. And I should let you know that this program is being recorded. The purpose of tonight's program is to give community members an opportunity to learn about Oregon's new land use laws and how they might impact our community. We'd like to begin by recognizing our elected officials who are here this evening, and I see in the second row here, Ward 9 Councilor Tony Cadena. Are there any other elected officials here? Ward 1 Councilor Jan Napak in the back corner. All right, thank you both for being here. Appreciate it. Our agenda for tonight is this. We'll start with a brief overview of the League, along with announcements of some upcoming programs. The bulk of our time together will be spent hearing from our panelists and having them respond to your questions. Now, when most people hear the name League of Women Voters, they think of voter registration and candidates forums. And for more than 100 years, the League has been the premier grassroots organization for voter education. But that is certainly not all that we do. The League is a nonpartisan, grassroots political organization that encourages informed and active participation in government. While the League never endorses or opposes political parties or candidates, we are at the forefront of identifying and addressing key issues in our society. We are directly involved in educating people about the important issues that keep our communities strong. The League is open to everyone, not just women. We have a lot of men who are members as well. And we invite you to join us. To join, please go to our website, lwvcorvallis.org, or visit the back table. At the local, state, and national levels, we have standing positions on a wide range of topics, positions that we use to influence public policy. Our positions vary widely, from climate change to housing, from waste management to voting rights, from agriculture to childcare. The League is also known for our work on empowering community members to become informed and engaged. Before we begin our program, I'd like to make a few announcements about upcoming opportunities. In February, there will be two programs that are part of our annual Know Your City series. The first, on February 6th, will be about the city's Parks and Recreation Department, and the speaker will be Parks and Recreation Director Meredith Pettit. Then on February 19th, we'll hear from Public Works Director Jeff Blaine about the city's aging infrastructure. We hope you'll join us for both of these important programs. Finally, I'd like to invite you to the follow-up discussion to tonight's program that will take place next Monday, February 3rd at 3 p.m., sponsored by the Sustainability Coalition's Land Use Action Team. If you'd like to join us to talk about what you learned tonight and to hear from others, we encourage you to participate. That meeting will be via Zoom, and you'll be able to access the Zoom link on the Corvallis Sustainability Coalition website. So at this time, I would like to introduce Barbara Bull of our Community Planning Committee, who will introduce tonight's program. Barbara?
Thank you. Thank you, Annette. Sorry, there's an echo up here, so it sounds like I'm talking to Washington DC somewhere. So I'm Barbara Bull. I was a counselor, city councilor here from 2014 to 2020. I'm currently a longtime admirer, new member of the League of Women Voters. I'm your moderator. I'm going to start by briefly introducing the speakers, and then I'm going to give them a chance to share with you guys how they first encountered their land use system here in Oregon. After they speak, I'll invite them back up to the table for a question answer period for about a half an hour. We don't have index cards tonight, so it'll be by hand raising. It'll be a little different. The system is picking up your voices, so we shouldn't have to hand around a microphone. Maybe I'll have to repeat your questions up here, so we'll see how that goes. On Zoom, people who want to ask questions, please use the question and answer, not the chat. This is a webinar. Yes.
Microphone towards your mouth.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
So quickly, I wanted to say how I encountered the land use system. In the 90s, working for Eugene Springfield metropolitan area transportation plan update, it was funded by the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act under George H.W. Bush, a Republican president. And two things that I thought were special about that act: it required citizen involvement, meaningful citizen involvement, and it required planning for all modes. So this is early 90s. In addition, in the state of Oregon, we had a requirement that a transportation plan reduced VMT, vehicle miles traveled per capita, by 10% over 20 years. So these sound like new ideas, but back then, transportation plan reducing emissions by a significant amount. And then to connect it to today, what does that have to do with land use? Well, in Eugene Springfield, they had 3 citizen task forces, not one, but 3. The first one was for transportation system planning. How do we build, where do we build roads? How do we build them? Bike lanes, sidewalks, etc. The next thing was demand management, which had to do with parking strategies, pricing, supply, transit frequency. These are hot topics today here in Corvallis, Oregon. And the last one was land use strategies. How do we arrange our land use so that we reduce emissions and have efficient transportation? So in the early 90s, we knew we had to do land use planning to reduce emissions for sustainability. It strikes me that this is very similar now to what we're calling climate friendly areas. And it sounds new, but this is 30 years later. So after that, I was on committee for citizen involvement for 10 years, then the budget commission, then city council. And it was actually at the city's citizen committee for citizen involvement that I met our first speaker, Peggy Lynch. She was a huge resource then in the 90s. And while she was at the state committee for citizen involvement, she's been involved with land use planning since 1972, from the local level in Washington County to helping form Metro, the Portland area regional government, to participating in state committees and legislation. She joined the League of Women Voters on the early 90s and participated in the 2002 League Land Use Planning Update. She served on the state Citizen Involvement Advisory Committee for LCDC In 2009, she took over as the League of Women Voters of Oregon's Natural Resources Coordinator for the action team. Following the 14 natural resource agencies, policies, and budgets with other league volunteers, which as far as I can tell is a full-time job.
Yes.
And is currently a member of the local Corvallis League. Please welcome our first speaker, Peggy Lynch. And please, Peggy, if you don't mind, tell us, how did you first encounter the Oregon land use? We did try to mute it before.
I think you need to mute your
Mike?
mic, I think. That's what I was told. Just following directions. Thank you, and thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. It's a good opportunity to learn more about land use planning in Oregon. So you heard in 1972 is when I started. My husband and I were looking for a home for our 1 3/4 children and a business that he was just beginning. So we needed to have a little bit extra room. And we knew enough to check around to see what the zoning was nearby the property. Didn't bother to look behind us because it was a swamp. It's now known as wetlands. But, you know, back then that's what it was called. And there were all kinds of animals. And it didn't look like it was a buildable area. The day we moved in, the bulldozers came. And we had ended up having a huge multi-complex behind us. The good news was that right behind our fence were the studio apartments, so there was less activity looking across from our backyard. But it did mean that I went down to the county to find out, what did I miss and what did I need to know about this whole system? As a part of that, I got very involved in Washington. This was, by the way, in Beaverton, or between Portland and Beaverton. So I got down to Washington County, which was our local government, to find out what was going on, and got very, very involved with that was, and then with 73, there was the need to go ahead and have community planning so that each of us could do community planning for those first comprehensive plans and development codes. So that's how I got started, and I have been at it ever since in various roles. So before I begin, I wanted to know how many of you were in Oregon in 1973 when our landmark statewide land use planning was adopted. Maybe a third to a quarter to a third. So my role this evening is simply to share that history as the League of Women Voters of Oregon was engaged in that history and as a foundation for the changes about which you will soon hear. In 1959, the League of Women Voters of Oregon adopted at convention a 4-year study of the state's role in the problems of urban growth. It became increasingly apparent that the problems of growth are beyond the jurisdiction of local government and required planning and implementation on an expanded geographic scale. During the '69 legislative session, the League of Women Voters of Oregon began its activity in land use by supporting a bill, Senate Bill 10, requiring that all counties adopt comprehensive plans, broad planning documents that generally envision the use of the lands. And then at the 1973 State League Convention, we adopted a 2-year study that emphasized private and public rights and responsibilities. League also supported adoption of Senate Bill 100, that magic bill, which created the Land Conservation and Development Commission, LCDC, and the department, DLCD. The commission, appointed by the governor, was directed to formulate statewide planning goals to be followed by city and county governments in developing local comprehensive plans. The bill included provisions for state review of local plans and widespread citizen involvement. The legislature suggested the first 10 goals: citizen involvement, assuring that local residents would help shape local planning; land use planning, that's number 2, noting that jurisdictions need to work together on planning. Agricultural land and then forest lands became the 2 next land uses, because they were the basis for our economy in Oregon in the 1970s, for those of you who weren't here. Open spaces, scenic and historic areas, and natural resources, acknowledging other important uses of our lands, from protecting special areas as well as the need for uses like gravel pits. Don't ask me why they were mixed together, but they were. Then there's a goal recognizing the areas subject to natural hazards and disasters. And you will hear more of that over the time because of our wildfire situations that we're having now in Oregon, seriously. Another on recreational needs, such as destination resorts. A goal on economic development because we had needs for other jobs besides ag and timber. And lastly, housing, goal 10, recognizing that there should be land set aside for people to live. The newly created Department of Land Conservation and Development took these 10 goals out to the public and had over 75 open hearings and workshops statewide. It was magical. As a result, Goal 11, public facilities, Goal 12, transportation, Goal 13, energy conservation. Remember, this was the 70s when we had the energy crisis. And Goal 14, urbanization, where the concept of urban growth boundaries are housed, were added. A few years later, Goal 15, the Willamette River Greenway, was added, and 4 coastal goals were folded in from another state program: estuarine resources, coastal shorelands, beaches and dunes, and ocean resources. The state land use planning program uses these 19 goals as guidance for local cities and counties to engage their residents in planning the use of their lands. Although each jurisdiction can make their decisions in developing their comprehensive plans and development codes, implementation requirements, those plans must be acknowledged or approved by the state DLCD. If local governments conflict with these 19 goals and additional state legislation approved and signed by the governor, because they have to follow those as well, the state has the responsibility to object to assure compliance. The Land Conservation and Development Commission, LCDC, can enforce compliance with the goals. And both the state and local participants in the program can appeal local decisions. Appeals processes, however, have changed tremendously over time. The League has provided input on the program in the years after, and in 1979 supported the establishment of the Land Use Board of Appeals. That board, appointed by the governor, handles land use appeals formerly heard by LCDC or the circuit courts. It was meant to help move things along and get an answer in a reasonable time. There were a number of legislative actions and voter initiatives over the years, and you can find a full history in our Issues for Action document on the lwvor.org website. Due to the number of changes, the State League did a restudy with the newly adopted positions in 1995. Separate from all this work, the League has a strong position on public involvement. The League continues to engage on land use and the 19 goals at the legislature every session. Matter of fact, DLC's budget is next week, and we will provide comment. We also provide testimony to LCDC as they consider program changes through rulemaking. Tonight, we're focused on Goal 10, housing. Like Goal 1, citizen involvement, there have not been many implementing rules adopted to guide local governments in exactly how to meet these goals. Goal 10 specifies that each city must plan for and accommodate needed housing types by inventorying its buildable residential lands, projecting future needs for such lands, and plan and zone enough buildable land to meet those needs. A lot of that has changed, by the way. You will hear that tonight. It also prohibits local plans from discriminating against needed housing types. Changes in this process as a result of state legislation has also occurred in the last few years. You will hear tonight from the Department of Land Conservation and Development, our state land use agency, and the city of Corvallis on the changes in laws intended to meet housing needs, and in some cases, changes in other goals in order to assure we provide housing for all Oregonians. Your local league and the State League continue to engage and help shape legislation and implementation of these changes. We hope you will continue the League's history of public involvement as you learn about these changes. Thank you.
Thank you, Penny, or Peggy. I asked Peggy to give a brief background. I think that was pretty thorough of where we started. At this point, I'll introduce you, and Paul, I'll give you the choice. Do you want to sit in the audience and see Ethan's slides, and then I'll introduce you later? Okay. So our next speaker, Ethan Stuckmeyer, is the Housing Division Manager at Oregon's Department of Land Conservation and Development. In his role, Ethan leads the implementation of Oregon's statewide planning goal 10, which is housing, as you've just heard. Ethan's background working as both a current and long-range land use planner in Oregon allows him to bring a unique perspective to his housing work at the state level. Prior to joining DLCD, Ethan worked in affordable housing policy at Oregon Housing and Community Services and as a project planner at McKinsey in Portland, Oregon. I didn't have you check this before I read it here. Ethan holds bachelor degrees in urban studies and economics from the University of Minnesota and a master's degree in community and regional development from the University of Oregon. Please welcome our next speaker, Ethan Stuckmeyer.
Thank you. I'll get that situated. While I pull up my slides, I think I was asked to talk about how I came to land use policy, but I feel like I'll start first. I'm a little biased probably because I've got this DLCD hat on. And I think the story that Peggy shared about the history of the land use planning program is really pretty a remarkable one. And I think that's always good to remind ourselves of that history and kind of where we started and what we're doing here today and how important it really is. So I am trying to get these slides going, so apologize for my delay here, but I've got it. All right. I came to land use in a little bit of a strange way. I lived in rural environments and suburban. Yes.
Microphone.
Microphone.
Figure it out louder.
I was trying to figure that out. Maybe I'll just hold it. All right. How about that?
Yeah.
Much better. All right. So I've lived in rural environments. I've lived in suburban environments. I've lived in urban environments, and I didn't really understand the differences between those things until I moved to Oregon, which happened in 2014, where I did an AmeriCorps program, the rural, it's known as RARE, the Resource Assistance for Rural Environments at the University of Oregon. And that's really where I learned about Senate Bill 100 and land use planning and housing planning and all of those things, and really have kind of done that ever since. And so I really do enjoy it. And I'll talk a little bit about why it's such an exciting time, an interesting time, and a crisis mode in housing in the state of Oregon at the current moment. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Oregon's recent housing planning and policy landscape, and really how that's shifted quite a bit from Peggy's overview of land use planning and housing planning of the 1970s. I'll start first with maybe some daunting figures. This is the most recent publication of Oregon's housing need over the next 20 years. And I apologize for the size of this font, but the punchline is over the next 20 years, the state of Oregon will have to produce 500,000 units of housing. Currently, the state produces about 22,000 units of housing a year. And so that's quite a feat ahead of us. What you're seeing on the screen here is a breakdown of those units by region and by income level. We'll talk a little bit about why these numbers are important, what they mean for cities across the state, and how this is changing the planning landscape, but we'll start there as kind of the precursor to this conversation. So Peggy talked about, maybe I can do something like this. Peggy talked about the statewide planning goals. There's 19 of them. We'll talk about goal 10, obviously, today. And this is the language of goal 10. And if you bear with me for just a moment, I'm going to read this slide to you. To provide for the housing needs of citizens of the state, buildable lands for residential use shall be inventoried, and plans shall encourage the availability of adequate numbers of needed housing units at price ranges and rent levels, which are commensurate with the financial capabilities of Oregon households and allow for flexibility of housing location, type, and density. So when we talk about planning in the state of Oregon and what it means to meet all of these markers of the statewide planning program, there's a lot there. And the way that we've been planning for housing really since the 1970s up until 2019 really was this. Pretty simple when we kind of think about those lofty goals or objectives of the statewide planning goal 10. When we kind of look at this in a little bit more detail, there's a couple main themes. We project population over the next 20 years. We estimate the household kind of configurations that might result from that population growth. We inventory, we compare that to the availability of land within our cities, particularly the UGB. And then we take measures to accommodate that housing, tweaks if we don't have enough land, if there's a deficit of land within our cities to meet that 20-year need. And if you're kind of thinking about, well, that's it. It's kind of, housing is a very complex set of factors, whether we're meeting our housing needs. But I would go as far to say that this program that was described kind of pre-2019 was one of those factors that kind of contributed to the state of housing in the state of Oregon. When we look at this graphic, we don't really get to anything like housing affordability when we're talking about zoning. That's a really hard thing to get to. Timing, when are cities taking these actions? How frequently are they going through this process? That was undefined. The efficacy of these measures to accommodate. How do we know if we're doing enough? How do we make that mixture? How do we set that balance of growth and growth up and growth out? An incentive, how are cities incentivized to take particular actions to meet the entirety of their housing need? These kind of things were missing from that program. And I think the bills, the legislation that I'll talk about here over the course of the next couple of slides is really, when we kind of boil it down, trying to get to some of these question marks of the old housing planning program of the past. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but these are some important kind of more recent pieces of housing legislation. Of note, a couple that I'll touch on here. House Bill 2001 from the 2019 legislative session. House Bill 2003, also from that same session. Touch a little bit on Senate Bill 458, not 468. And then House Bill 2001 from the 2023 session, and Senate Bill 1537 from just last year. Let's talk about these in a little bit more detail, each of these. So really, I think my introduction to housing planning in Oregon did start when I was that rare member, but really pretty more acutely, it was around middle housing. At the time in 2017, 2018, 2019, the state's really having this conversation, a more energetic conversation about the state's housing crisis and kind of pulling at these levers on how to address that. And kind of the topic of the day in 2019 was this idea of, well, we've got single family zoning, we've got multifamily zoning, but what's in between? There's kind of this missing middle of housing that we've got in the state. There's this gap between these rungs in a ladder. And maybe we can begin to bring those closer, blur the lines a little bit of what kind of housing we are providing for folks in our communities. And fundamentally, middle housing is about allowing more units in more places in our communities. So what is middle housing? Well, it's defined as duplexes, 2 units, triplexes, 3, quadplexes, 4 units, townhouses, and cottage clusters. These are housing types that pre-2019, the passage of House Bill 2001, were pretty much across the state illegal to build by definition in our development codes of the state. House Bill 2001 changed that and said cities of a particular size must allow these housing types in all areas of our communities. For cities top 10,000 and to 25,000 population, the requirement was to allow duplexes. Larger cities were required to allow triplexes, quadplexes, townhouses, and cottage clusters in areas that were zoned for the development of detached single-family dwellings. 2019 was an important moment in this kind of process, but as we know, the legislature builds on those pieces of legislation. And in 2021 and 2023, the legislature has expanded the applicability of middle housing and the use of middle housing across the state in two distinct ways. The first, Senate Bill 458, kind of expanded middle housing into kind of a home ownership element. One of the biggest critiques of middle housing in 2019 was that, well, this is just about rental housing, right? At the end of the day, you're building a duplex and the property owner rents out each of those units to somebody or lives in one and rents the other. But because there's barriers to the ability of those property owners, those landlords to sell those units. And Senate Bill 458 changed that and said, in fact, you can divide the properties in half or in thirds or a quarter and sell each of those individual unit or those lots with one unit on it for home ownership opportunities. And that was really kind of a watershed moment, I guess, in this kind of middle housing space. And we've seen quite a bit of use of Senate Bill 458 since then. And then House Bill 3395, just a couple of years ago, expanded middle housing to cities that are smaller than 10,000, so 2,500 population. Those cities also need to allow duplexes in the same manner. Also in 2019, when we're talking about middle housing, that's like pure housing production, development of housing, allowance of housing, but there are other elements, other policies, other actions that cities can take to incentivize housing production, affordability, and choice in their communities. And that comes through in what's called a housing production strategy under the passage of House Bill 2003. You can think of a housing production strategy as a game plan that the city is going to set themselves forward with to address the entirety of their housing need, right? So when they're doing their housing planning, they've got a need that they're planning for over, in the future. And they're taking actions to achieve that goal of that housing. And they have to do this kind of planning exercise on a regular cycle. The House Bill 2003 requires cities outside of the Portland metro to do, 10,000 population and greater, to do a housing production strategy, conduct this exercise. What is your game plan over the next 8 years to accommodate your needed housing? Specifically, what are the actions that you're taking? And then, oh, by the way, we'll check back on how those actions have met those targets or not. Have you taken the actions? Have you had to amend those actions? Are you sticking to your plan over time? Those are all new elements to this housing production strategy program in the state of Oregon. And then I think one of the things that happened when we were talking about housing production strategies as well, we're a city council, we can't really make these decisions for future city councils. That's a really hard place for us to be in, as the councilors in the room might attest to. But the commitment of the jurisdiction is not to the particular actions, but it's a commitment to meeting the need. So if a future council wants to change the action, specific action, they still have that obligation to go to a plan B that meets that particular housing need that action is intended to achieve. And on the right of the screen here is kind of a menu of options of sorts that cities, these are the kind of things that we're talking about when we're talking about housing production strategies, is not just zoning. It's things like public-private partnerships. It's things like taxes. It's things like financial incentives and resources. It's kind of the gamut of tools in the toolbox. So we get to 2023, and all the while we're talking about housing production strategies and middle housing, our department, DLCD, was tasked with recommending a larger long-term change to the housing planning program that had not been updated since the 1970s. And, like I mentioned, was playing a role, not the only role, but a role in the state's housing shortage. And what was born out of those recommendations is this Oregon housing needs analysis, which really shifts that focus of planning at the local government level away from things like zone capacity, how much land we have, what are the acres to accommodate housing, to the actual actions that cities can take, not just zoning, but other actions to facilitate housing production, affordability, and choice, and to meet the identified housing need. So the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, and I apologize for the header. I noticed this error just before I walked in the door. But the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, ONA, as it's known, is a comprehensive reform to the state's housing planning process. Like I mentioned, that hadn't happened since the 1970s. And what this really does is it changes the way that cities plan for not only goal 10 housing, but also for urbanization, right? When we're talking about housing and growth in the next 20 years, we're also talking about how our city grows, how our city urbanizes. And the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis plays into both of those processes. One of the kind of fundamentally what the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis does, if you recall that graphic from the first slide, when we're talking about that kind of basis of housing planning, we are estimating our future growth. And in the previous paradigm, that was solely on population projection. It didn't account for underproduction. It didn't account for people experiencing homelessness. It didn't account for the impact of second vacation homes. And the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis does that. It estimates housing need at the statewide level using all of those factors that I was talking about, and allocates the need at the regional level down to each jurisdiction within that region based on a number of factors: rate of population growth, access to jobs, transportation networks, also a number of factors in that kind of weighting of allocation from the region to the local government. And that gets the business, or gets the cities out of the business of calculating need and into the business directly of taking those actions and jumping right into the policymaking space, which they are really, really good at. And so just kind of that key point, that refocus of the housing planning program away from zoned capacity and whether or not we have enough land, that's still an element of the housing planning program. But really the focus is about taking those actions, taking local actions within their control. All right, I'm noticing my time and I think I've got it right on, but there's one more piece of legislation to kind of talk about, which is a pretty recent piece of legislation in the 24 session. This is Governor Kotek's bill, Senate Bill 1537. Among many other things in that bill, it establishes what's known as the Housing Accountability and Production Office. And this office is a new entity within the state. It's a joint office between our department, the Department of Land Conservation and Development, and the Building Codes Division of the Department of Consumer and Business Services. So right there, you're thinking about, okay, I'm thinking about the land and I'm thinking about the buildings. That seems like a really good opportunity for coordination and collaboration. And so what the office does, it formalizes that collaboration to remove barriers to housing, period. Statewide barriers, local barriers to the development of housing. That happens in a couple ways. And again, apologies for the header. This should say key elements of Senate Bill 1537, 2024. The Housing Production or Housing Accountability and Production Office, known as HAPO, which is quite a funny name if you ask me. HAPO is to boost production of housing via a particular method, support developers and cities in the faithful implementation of state housing laws, in navigating the sometimes muddy and rough regulatory environment and funding environment at the state, kind of hand in hand, walking cities and developers through that process, and then coordinating across agencies, state agencies, DLCD, Business Oregon, Oregon Housing Community Services, ODOT, others on our programs and our fundings, and making sure that those are speaking well with each other in the service of removing barriers to housing and juicing housing production. And if you're thinking about, oh, there's accountability in the name of this office, there's a shared accountability, not only of those agencies that are coordinating across each other, and for the state to be meeting its housing production targets as set by the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis and the governor, but also to local governments, right? As we're going through things like middle housing legislation, things like the housing production strategy legislation. Those are bills that have been passed in Salem and should be implemented across the state, right? And the Housing Accountability and Production Office is a way to ensure that the state housing laws that the state has passed are being implemented across the state in the manner that was intended. But the approach is really collaboration first. Let's get us collectively, the state and local governments, across the finish line in achieving those housing production goals and not jumping straight to enforcement. Collaboration first, enforcement last, only in the situations where it's necessary and only after repeated kind of non-compliance by both state agencies, local governments, so on and so forth. So those are the suite of housing policies that I wanted to mention. I'll leave you with this number again, or this table again, which, you know, when we're talking about all of these policies and some of these, you know, you may agree with, maybe don't on the approach, but really it's all in service of, you know, 500,000 units over the next 20 years. So.
Thank you, Ethan. 1 second, leave my computer. So I just want to say, working in the early 90s, I would say the attitude was, where I was working, we do the projections, we estimate the need, we zone the land, and the housing will come. And what I think we just heard was from 1972 to close to 2020, that's how it was. And everything that he just talked about was in the last 5 years, and it's a completely different attitude. So Paul Bellata moved back to Oregon to become the community development director for the city of Corvallis in 2016. Previously, he was the community development director for 2 cities in Minnesota and began his career in the university community of Champaign, Illinois. Paul has been a consultant for award-winning projects in the United States and Canada, and a developer of retail and residential developments in a number of states across the country. He has a bachelor's degree in urban and regional planning from University of Illinois and a master's of business administration from the University of Michigan. I think we have a nice variety of backgrounds here. So Paul, if you'd like, will you tell us how you first encountered Oregon land use and your impressions? Thanks.
Yeah, my first encounter was not as long as Peggy, but it was 1980. And I was living in that city with the inferior university to the south of us. And at that time, the statewide land use was pretty new. Issues that we were dealing with there was who's the better biking community, us or Davis, California? And there was a lot there. We were also, a lot of effort was being put in place on neighborhood level planning and doing interesting things. It was more what I would call classical planning, where we took honest attempts at assuming what the population growth would be and then tried to accommodate that. And then the other big issue is the answer to regional malls to take the cars away from the downtown, or is it to let the cars go through the downtown? And that was a long time. If you've been down to the mall recently, I think downtown did win, but it took a while. And then came back here in 2016. It was interesting to, I'd wandered away for a couple decades and to come back here and see what the land use program had become at that time. And very different place. It was, I think I blame California. It's easy to blame, but also California has a very unique way of looking at land use, which is that it's a legal contract, legal rights, property rights. It's all about conflict. And if everybody just looks out for their personal interest, we'll figure out something that'll work. Whereas the rest of the world tends to look at it as a collaborative process where you're looking at honest data and you're trying to accommodate, come up with the most efficient system. So it was very surprising leaving Eugene in the early stages of this and coming back here, where I cannot tell you how many times I have had discussions about whether a semicolon or a comma have the same legal meaning. And I was confronted with an 1,100 page land development code. So so that's my history with land use so far. Not that I'm jaded. As you saw earlier, there have been a lot of housing laws over the last 10 years here. The legislature's been very, very busy. This is just since 2021. And I'm not going to go through them all, but I just want to kind of let them sit there for you for a minute. I will tell you that it's more daunting than what you see, because in many of these years, the legislature had walkouts. So 2021, I think, was a walkout year. At least 2021 gives me a scar tissue, because all this was going on and we didn't know what was going on. And then and you didn't know what was going to come or didn't know what was going to come. And these bills didn't reconcile. So we had all this flurry of single issue bills coming at us. And one of them is telling us that we should ignore density now. And another one's coming at us saying, well, you should have a density bonus over here. And some people are getting height bonuses and other people are getting height bonuses over here. And you don't know if these are going to be cumulative or not. So it was a little crazy on our end to try to figure out what we were getting. It goes on to page 2. So this is where we go here. But the two that have really, I think, locally been a lot of what people have paid attention is the middle housing, and then climate friendly and equitable communities. And so middle housing is not much different than what Corvallis had before in the 2006 land use code. The main difference was Corvallis had about 2/3 of the city that it said, yeah, we're not going to put those other types of housing in your area. And middle housing broke that wall down and said everybody's going to get middle housing. Why are we doing all this housing stuff? This is from the Atlanta Fed, and I know it doesn't make any sense. But the way to look at it is the line going across means that housing is affordable. And if you're above the line, housing is very affordable. And if it's below the line, housing's not affordable at all. And so on the left side, you see the housing crisis nationally. And then on the right side, you see where we are now. So, there is a lot going on. I don't want to minimize what's going on, but understand there is some pretty big national stuff going on that's behind all of this. And there's some handouts in the back that walk through some of that. Locally here, we do a same kind of calculation, but in a different way. And in this one, the gray line is what people can afford in housing. And you can see that back in the original housing crisis, Corvallis kind of came out without too much trouble. But then we've now deviated, and this is the cost. When the blue is higher than the gray, that means that the housing is becoming unaffordable. And you can see we're in uncharted territory here, as is the country. Then another thing we do to track how we're doing is looking at commuters. And you can see that back in about the turn of the century, we were fairly well balanced between people that commuted in, lived here and commuted out, and lived and worked in town. But then we didn't accommodate any of the economic growth, and we just had the same people that were living in town or leaving town, and all of the growth occurred through our suburban neighbors like Albany and Philomath and places like that. So it just kept on going. You will see that when we did start putting in reforms now, we are seeing that incoming move, and a lot of this has to do with some remote work policies and things too. But the interesting piece here is that we're seeing the uptick. The first uptick is actually out commuters, people living in Corvallis and working elsewhere. We have a lot of people, qualitatively, we're getting a lot of Salem folks. So then when the legislature passes all that legislation, then it falls down on us to then do something with it. And so we've had to do, these are just the ordinances that we've had to pass to accommodate all of that. And these are not 3 paragraphs and a couple word changes. Some of these are well over 100 pages. By the time we got done with this, we've cut the land development code 300 to 400 pages just in the last few years. That also continues on for another page. And we also had to go in and change the comp plan some too. So all in all, that's 25 ordinances. So what's the public engagement impact? Here I have to pause because there's a unique Corvallis thing here when we're talking state law. So Corvallis in 1970 had a election where anti-growth and growth was on the ballot. And anti-growth lost, and it was bitter. And so what happened was, and there was a pretty strong feeling across the city that, Corvallis is as big as it should be, or maybe it should be a little smaller. And so just to give you a couple quotes here. So this is from 1976, the Citizen Participation Program of the Corvallis Comprehensive Plan. There is little or no support for an increased population growth. 62% of those responding in the questionnaire and at the meeting favored a reduction in the growth rate. This is an official document produced by the city of Corvallis and my own planning department in 1975, giving the community members guides on how to avoid zoning changes. And so you can see this whole anti-growth was really in there. Well, then what happened was, because the election at the council level didn't work, they went for changing the system so elections wouldn't matter. And so the first piece right after the election was putting in the 2-year council terms for councilors and also the 9 wards. And that was a key piece of the anti-growth piece. The idea was make the terms so short that council members would be afraid to stand up to a neighborhood that wanted to oppose development, and also to split the council into such small wards that everybody would be afraid of any particular neighborhood. You couldn't like have a big ward and go, well, they're upset, but I'll still vote yes, I'll be over here. Then voter approved annexation came in 1976. State law has now invalidated that one, so that doesn't exist. Then we made it easier to appeal development projects in 76 as well. Then a voter approval requirement in urban renewal, and all this is in the charter. So this is the community getting signatures and changing this. This is not the council. And then we built underneath that, we misused the plan development process to basically make it so that every development had to, for the most part, every development had to come through for a vote of the community. So y'all, anybody who's been here, you've been to a lot of public hearings. And when I got here, you were really good at going to public hearings. I mean, it was like, wow. But there was a case that happened right before I got here called Kings Boulevard Extension that ended up going through appeal. The council staff recommended it, but the council denied it. It was kind of a lightning rod at the state. Everybody jumped on that case. It was getting hit right and left. We didn't know where we were. I mean, we were getting taken to LUBA and LCDC and maybe over here. And what ended up happening out of it was a LCDC enforcement action. And it basically said, Corvallis, it's over. You can't do this anymore. And there'd been a little bit of dancing around with DLCD for about 20 years where they'd go, Corvallis, you're doing, like we used to require a mandatory plan development, which isn't right. And they said, you can't do that. And we're like, okay, well, we'll do it this way. And then we'll do it this way. Well, this one where they really brought the big hammer out and it's done. And then just in case that wasn't enough, the legislature came back then the following year and said, everything you did to Corvallis, let's put in a law to do that to everybody. And so that was really the end of things and where this became going forward. And then the other thing we had as part of the voter approved annexation issue is that the areas just outside of the city, Goal 14 calls for really what we call the urban fringe. That's the area between the urban growth boundary and the city boundary, that's really supposed to be largely undeveloped. And that the goal is to keep that in reserve so that utilities and streets and everything can be extended efficiently. Well, if you've ever looked at an aerial map, we are broken up into rural, residential, all over the place around the city. And so, that was large, the county didn't do that on purpose. The county would do that when a vote went down for annexation, then they would do it. The kind of classic example of that one is if you've gone up to Chip Ross, there's a development there that has some very large houses. And that originally came to the city as a 400 unit development. And the council turned that down and wouldn't put it out to the voters. Then it came back, they came back with, I think, half that much. I think it was about 200. And the council said, okay, we have to put this out to the voters, and the voters turned it down. And so then it turned out to be, I think it's like 16, 18 mansions. So when you look at, how that goes, that's where it is. And I heard from people who were here at that time that there was a little bit of dancing when that vote occurred, because they thought this was the cork in the bottle, and Corvallis will never be able to extend past that. So, so when we look at our public engagement impacts, not that big, remember this was an intro. The thing you're feeling the most is not what DLCD is and the legislature is doing to you now. what you're feeling most about the change in public engagement and with development is this LCDC Kings Boulevard enforcement order. So that's the thing that, and so we have to kind of separate those two because people think that the state is taking away a lot of things, but it's really Corvallis had swung the pendulum in one way that it shouldn't have, and the state's going in the opposite direction. So most of the state is not having the whiplash that we are here because most of the state was not doing that other thing. There's been a decrease in time for implementation of code changes. When we started this run, we were talking about things like everybody should be able to have an ADU. And I think the legislature gave us like 2 years to do code for ADUs. Now, the state's not giving us the time to do anything. The one that really threw us off here, because we had you probably remember we used to have no more than 5 unrelated people could live in a house. That bill came out and was one line, just one sentence. It just said, you can't do this anymore. And it was effective the day it came out. Well, we had land development code that referred to that. We had municipal code that referred to that. And so how do you comply with even the building code that the state provided us had that in there? And so we were like, I don't even know whether we can do that or not. No one knew and stuff. So that's been what's been jumping around. There's been a lot more need to do things which we don't like to do, like special ordinances where the council says, we're going to grant the city manager the ability to do this so that we comply with state law until such time as we can do it the right way, because you have to do public hearings and all that sort of stuff. So that's been tough. Obviously, these code amendments don't get done without staff. I don't know if Jason Yike, oh, there he is back there by the door. Jason Yike's group, the guy ducking there. Why aren't you typing up more ordinances? His group, six very, very good people we have not expanded that staff at all, but that means we don't get to do some other things. And a lot of what we were just about we were in the process of starting up was a lot of engagement, neighborhood planning. The thing that's really taken the biggest hit on that is the South Corvallis area plan. Then the sub-state has had prescriptive limitations on public engagement. So don't get me wrong. There is definitely some legislative intent to not hear from you. If you read through some of these things, particularly when you get around shelter, some affordable housing, there's some really prescriptive things saying you can't talk to, everybody can go anywhere and there can be no public hearing, there can be no this, there can be no this, there can be no this. So there's definitely some lobbying side saying the problem is really all of us. And that's not true, but there's definitely that feeling in some places. The map impacts. Normally you couldn't move uses from one, we used to have a thing called rezoning. And when we do a rezoning, we say, oh, this is not going to be commercial anymore. This is going to be residential. And then we have a big public hearing and we all get to talk about whether that's a good idea or not a good idea. Well, the legislature's been putting a lot of what I call super siting, where they say, well, yeah, for most things that's still true, but these few preferred uses, we're going to let them do things nobody else could do and there's no public hearing. So shelter, right now, shelter can be on any lot, anywhere in the city, and that's just it. Affordable housing can be in commercial areas, which is, it's the place where it really causes a lot of trouble as professional planners is like in downtowns, where like here, our downtown is fairly close to the university. It would not take too many full block student housing projects to really disrupt how the commercial area work. Downtowns are kind of delicate to go. And so that's another issue where you haven't, you don't get to talk about that anymore because they don't have to go through a rezoning process. They just get to do it. And that's the bad. The good, that was the hard part. I think 21 to 23 was where it hurt the most. But now the state is starting to get into a more sustainable thing. They're increasing the staffing at DLCD considerably. Part of the reason things were coming at us crazy through the legislature is there was no one to work on anything. And so the only advice they had was the lobbyists in their ear. And it was just coming through. And now we've got enough staff there that we're starting to get more clear code requirements. And that has two sides. One positive on our side from the staff perspective is there are discussions with the LCD staff where we do talk through some of these things like, if you do this, I don't think it's going to be clear, or that might conflict with this. And you can do something where you can't negotiate like that with the legislature itself. But also, it can be a little frustrating sometime on the community side, because if the standards are very, very straight, or very, very clear, and there's no ability to change it, then when you come to your public hearing and you say, I don't like that thing, we say, well, that's fine. It can, it says 5, and it can be any number as long as that number is 5. And so, so that has been a little bit of a challenge. I think, particularly in middle housing, I think that was really we had a lot of community interest in that, and it was very hard for a lot of community members that we had committees and everything, but everything that they wanted to talk about were things that they couldn't, that the state said they couldn't change. So, and so that, again, that's that last one there, that the increasing staff has been very helpful and will continue to be helpful. And that's me.
Thank you, Paul. So I had asked Peggy for a background. If you guys don't mind coming up to the table, we'll try to get questions and have you answer them from there. Ethan, I think, did a great job of taking the past into the current day. And then Paul was asked to help us understand what that means here in Corvallis, what all this changes at the state mean in town. So I think you got a lot of information. I'm sure there are a lot of questions. I guess we can start with hands, and I can start with one big picture question. I think we started envisioning balancing a whole lot of goals, and that's residential, it's urbanization, it's natural features, it's transportation. I think people who were used to that last 30 or 40 years feel like maybe that's being blown up and we don't have any of it anymore. But listening to perspective, another perspective is what we're doing is a better job of reaching those goals by, as Ethan described, doing a better job of implementing it. And I just wonder, how do you guys see that? Are we abandoning the old land use system, or are we enhancing it? And then you have a mic there. Anybody can start.
So I'll start out really quickly, and then I'm going to pass it off quick too. So a lot of the goals are really still applicable and are being used today in many, many areas. The housing one that we've talked about tonight is the one for which there has just been a huge, huge change. And so although there are 19 goals, one of them is really getting a revamp, a big revamp. And that's where you're going to see the differences. Otherwise, we still protect our ag land, we still protect our forest land, we still care about our natural resource areas. So that's part of it.
Yeah, I think the thing to remember with the goals is that that's the policy piece. So that's kind of at the local level, it would be equivalent to our comprehensive plan. And I think where we get into trouble with the goals is when we focus in on just them as a single issue, and we think of them as being regulatory in the same way we would have regulation. But these policies are always in conflict with each other, and that they're to be looked at as a whole. So for instance, in Corvallis, we have a policy to preserve open space and particular types of open spaces. We also have a policy to have compact urban development. These two are inherently at conflict. And so what happens is you have to take these two policy conflicts, and the council figures out where that dividing line is, and that dividing line becomes the regulation. So when people look at the statewide goals, I think you need to look at it from that perspective, that we are, housing and economic development are both pieces that are in there. But when we're allowing housing to go into a downtown area, that's moving that line over into this direction. But they're never intended to be all that this goal rules over every other goal.
Yeah, I mean, just echoing that last piece from Paul, I think, those are all 19 statewide planning goals, and all of them share equal weight in the way that planning program works. And so, that balance is really like when the rubber meets the road, that's what we're really talking about, that sweet spot of how do we balance all of these things and achieve all of these goals? Housing, economic development, transportation options, all of those things simultaneously. And I think if I'm channeling the director of my department, like we can do those things, right? We can strive for those complete communities. We can have those nice things. We just have to think about, that balance a little bit differently, maybe.
I have a mic here to come around for questions.
Thank you. I guess I'll direct my question probably locally to Paul. So with what you've seen with the changes that have come down the pike in the last couple of years, you've been around here almost a decade now, and so you've kind of seen the historical development pattern. But knowing what you know, being in your position down at the city with what's happening at development services, as well as more the longer term planning projects, how do you see, like, say, for example, maybe in the next 5 years, what changes are we likely to see in Corvallis that might differ from what we've seen in the past?
Yeah, good question. And I think the other piece of that is, I hope that this can go back up to DLC, is understanding that it's very easy to change legislation, but the market is going to take several years to adapt to that. And so we are seeing changes that we put in place 2-3 years ago. And that's about as long as it takes to gather, find a piece of property, understand how it goes and do all this thing. So our biggest thing that we've seen is, affordable housing was where we had put our effort probably about 4 years ago in creating, and, Corvallis had no land for apartments. We had no high density residential and we hadn't had it for 20 years. So when and everybody's like, where are the students supposed to go? We aren't giving them any places. So the council, I think Barbara was on the council at this time, looked at the entire city and found places for high density residential to go and where that it would be appropriate to be in the city. And from that, 2024, we had more affordable housing constructed in Corvallis than was ever constructed in the city combined. There's almost 400 units, and the places where that occurred, the property that the council identified on South 3rd to go to high density residential, the property that was rezoned over on Country Club and 53rd. We still need the guy over there by HP to come there and develop, but they've really, that really hit. Now, after that, we went into the market rate. And so we did a lot of reform on downtown zoning. We've done some different things with incentives to try to then work our way up into the market rate as well. You're going to see that now. That's where I think the most surprise is going to go. In fact, the second meeting in February at council, you will see the first request under what's called a MUPTI tax exemption program come in, and that'll be 93 units of market rate apartments downtown. That's not the only one out there. There's some other stuff going on that's confidential, and you've heard a lot of people, some people kind of a little murmur in the community that downtown is dying. It's not. When you see a string of vacant storefronts, that's most likely someone who is acquiring the whole block face to do something else. So there are definitely strings of block faces out there. I can't tell you where they are, but you can see with your own eyes what's happening. And so we're seeing actually more reinvigoration of downtown. So I think those are the biggies. And then the other one that's coming here is all of that rural residential that's on the edge of town. Those smaller 2, 3, 4 acre lots are going to start coming in on quick annexations. We now have that process. It would have never made sense to do under voter approved annexation. You would have needed, $50,000, $60,000 to do the political action part of it all. And so you're going to see, and we've got a lot of places that's going to help a lot of places like down 53rd where we've had septic failures. We're not a great place for septic tanks. We're good at retaining what we don't want to retain and not being able to hold the water we do want to do. So yeah, it's a problem. And then up on the Highland area, we've got wells going dry. So I think you're going to see a lot of those kind of rural residential pieces start to pop in, either for that purpose or for redevelopment.
Paul?
Yeah.
Quickly.
Yeah.
So the other thing I want to make sure that you all hear, and you just heard a part of what will happen in the urban growth boundary area of Corvallis. And it's a conversation that you're going to have with the Know Your City. And that's infrastructure and the cost to put pipes in the ground and roads. And that's going to be a conversation that you as a community are going to have to help with, because the developers are not going to be able to pay it all, particularly if half the units we need are for lower income housing units. So maybe a market rate developer is going to be able to pick up the tab, but the rest of the population, and we know what kind of a homeless situation we have, is going to have to figure out how to pay the tab and what's the right amount to pay. So.
Real quick, I mean, when we're talking about like what kind of future, and I don't live in Corvallis, but it's a lovely community. When we're talking about planning, and I apologize to some of the planners in the room, including myself, planning sometimes is a really funny profession where we're planning for this future that is different than the future or than the present day, right? Always. That is always the task of a planner, is think about how we can fix some of these problems of our society, right? And knowing full well that we probably aren't always going to achieve that goal of planning for that future. But our responsibility as city folks and planners is to set the stage for that future, knowing that this room has no impact on things like interest rates or the cost of pipes. Those are like real factors, real contributors or defactors from how we can achieve that future. And so I think the really important part when we're talking about that, what does the next 20 years look like, Corvallis, Eugene, whatever city we're talking about, it is a different future, but we have to go into that thinking that there are factors that have a greater impact on our planning for that future.
I'll sneak in.
I'll sneak in an online question because it's related, if that's okay. Oh,
Well,
Susan? Okay, just on this topic, if that's
Yes.
okay.
Yeah.
There's only a couple. How does the need for transportation fit into the housing picture? Should we build housing that overwhelms local transportation systems, causing an angry public? Or can we implement limits on housing while streets are sized for the volumes that come from housing? And I think that's just a nice on the ground question that people worry about.
Anyone?
I'll pass it down to the rest of you to help. So part of it is that in this next legislative session, we are actually talking about transportation. What kind of transportation do we want to pay for? And in the whole conversation about, are we going to look at only cars? Is that the only way that we are always going to get around? And that is a big part of the transportation conversation this session.
I'll pass this one.
All right, transportation. Yeah, this is where housing and climate are coming together. And it's always fun in Corvallis because I remember about 5 years ago being at one of these and saying that I was predicting that the next battle in the community would be over parking, and that half of you would want more and half of you would want none. So I think I was right. And so with the transportation, the biggie that we're heading into now is there is no off-street parking requirements in the city. And that rolls down into a lot of different things. It means that at some point, it does not mean this immediately, but the way that you handle that sort of an issue in the future is you get rid of free parking in places where it's in demand. And so pay parking may occur in places that you don't, and the prices rise more in the places that are in high demand and they're less in the other places. And so it's this market-based approach to that. When you control parking, that also controls how you got there. If you don't want to pay the price, then you might look at an alternative mode and those sorts of things. So we're doing that piece, and that there's a process going on in our Public Works Department on that right now. We, of course, also are working to get our low stress bike network up and going, so people have that alternative. We've got, we still have our fareless transit. At least at this point, it has not been, the money has not been frozen. So we're good there. You can still get on the bus tomorrow. But I think that's the key, is to get a resilient system that gives people options.
And I'm sorry, I will bite. I think that's the big thing. How transportation choice, housing choice, right? Those are the keys to answering that question about how you strike that balance. And I think the big question that we always grapple with, at least on my team and throughout the department, I think, is, do we want to make sure that everybody has a house, a place to live, or do we want to make sure everybody has a car and a place to park that car? And I think that's a really, really interesting question when you frame it that way.
So, and just so you know, the league will be supporting the transportation portion where there will be more transit dollars coming in to help transit actually happen throughout the state.
Okay, thanks. So Paul and Peggy both partially answered my question I had earlier, which was how we can incentivize and attract more mixed use housing and downtown, especially having a more vital downtown where people are more present throughout the day and the evening. So I'm excited about those things coming forward. And my other question is, as we are trying to achieve more density and being required to have things like fourplexes on a single family housing lot, how are we balancing that with protection of open space, tree cover, natural resources, wetlands, so that we help address climate change, avoid urban heat island effects, and keep it a livable, beautiful city that people can enjoy without having to drive to some open space?
So I suspect I'm going to let Paul answer part of this, but I just want you to know, from the league's perspective, the statewide league is very, very active in protecting the wetlands of Oregon. And there is a guidance that we should not have a net loss of wetlands in the state. And we will continue to say that that's a critical thing. That does not mean we do not need more housing and that people should have a place to live. There also was legislation last session or the session before to increase tree canopy, because heat islands are a very real issue in larger urban areas. And so we know that we need to have livable communities and not just housing units.
All right. Yeah, a couple things there. One is our natural resources are mapped. So the city did go through that process and map those. It gets to be a little challenging when we have some things that whole plan development misuse thing causes problems, because it locks in old code that happened before that natural resources. So that can be confusing for people sometimes when they see a resource mapped and then it's bulldozed, but that's because it's something that was a previous code that's in place from there. But yeah, anything going forward, we have those sorts of protections in place. On the urban heat island part, that's where there's interesting things coming up in CFAC, climate friendly. Sorry, I'm using the acronyms there. Since we got rid of the requirement to have parking lots, we went the other direction too and said, if you are going to build a surface parking lot, and this is state law, you get a couple choices. You can either go down the eliminate greenhouse gases or offset greenhouse gases by producing solar energy. So there's a formula of half a kilowatt, I believe, per parking space, right? Yeah. All right. For larger parking lots, it's parking lots like over 5 spaces. Or if you don't want to build solar, you can give $1,500 to a statewide fund that will produce community solar somewhere, well, where to do it. But the third option is the urban heat island option. And if you do urban heat island, you can do much more intensive tree cover to cover those areas up. You're also going to see, I think, some we haven't seen the code fully on this yet, or seen it happen out in the wild yet, but with what's called MS4, some of the stormwater requirements, you're going to see potentially more green roof kind of concepts out there and things, but the market hasn't caught up to that. That's fairly new for this area. But yeah, there's going to be things out there, but they're all it's all, because it's housing, it all has to be clear and objective. So it's all in the code.
Paul?
Yeah.
Quickly.
Yeah.
So just to follow up with that, and back with the wetlands, for instance, the Department of State Lands has in its budget for this session to provide more help for local governments to make sure that they have the right wetlands listed on their maps. And that's the kind of thing that we're looking at. If we're going to do this change, and we're going to have a change in our community, we have to figure out how to do it the right way to have those livable communities that we've always had. They're just going to be different.
Sorry, on the wetland issue, I got to touch on wetlands. The protection of the wetlands isn't what's generating a lot of discussion around the state right now. It's the processing of the permits for wetlands that's the problem. And so,
Changing the fees.
yeah. So the state, Oregon is one of the states that has not yet taken over regulation of federal. So it's a two-part. You might get the state, you may get the Corps of Engineers, depending on which wetland you're in. That process here, I was working for a couple decades in Minnesota. Wetland mitigation was about 60 to 90 days. The standards were well understood. You knew where you were going in, everything else. We have a project in South Corvallis of about 440 units that is in wetland approvals. They've already agreed that they were going to give up 30 to 40% of the site in wetlands. We've already mapped which ones were the intense ones. They were just scattered ones. They're in year 5 of trying to get through here. So,
So we're working on staff.
yeah. So that's the issue. It's the processing more than it is the protection.
And we all know time is money, especially when it comes to development and housing. We have a time for 1 or 2 more questions. Do you want to, or we have a couple? So we'll have and if we get quicker answers, we'll get 2 or 3.
I have a question for Ethan. When the state is calculating the level of need for housing, are you taking consideration climate refugees coming up from the Southwest, especially?
Not directly, but I would say it's captured in things like demographic and population change, but only as like a tertiary kind of, it's not even really secondary approach, like very indirectly is the answer to that question. But when we're thinking about the way that those housing needs are allocated from the region level to local governments, that's really where that kind of factors in. That rate of population, that increase of population, the change in demographics is a factor in how that allocation is made.
So just so you understand, the allocation is really made by our state economist and not by DLCD, although he certainly listens to the information from DLCD. So it is our state economist is doing it. And the league has talked to the state economist more than once about factoring climate refugees in their revenue forecast, as well as these population growths.
Yep.
Thank you. Really quick.
So with no parking regulations, today, if something were being built like the housing units at 53rd and Country Club, could those be built with no parking? And then where would cars go, because those streets around there don't have parking?
Yeah. So the answer is yes. What the situation is that basically you're relying on the development to decide whether that makes sense. And there are, developments. In another state, we had a development that was an apartment building geared towards bicycle advocates. And it had a bike shop in the first floor and everything. Last thing they wanted was car park requirements. And it worked fine because they knew their clientele and it worked. Across the street, an apartment had cars. So you may get some niching that goes on that way. I think in this town, you'll see, downtown probably won't have a lot of car parks. You're within walking distance of the university. If you're a student, you are at the hub for the transit. We have lots of bikeways in and out. So there's really not a whole lot of reason to need to own a car if you want to in the downtown. And so I think around the campus, you may see similar things too, where people might build some apartments that are geared more towards a pedestrian student environment rather than car parks. So it's really up to the market. And then if you get pockets where the on-street parking gets to be heavy, that's where this parking philosophy that the state's under is, it would call for there to be regulation through fees for on-street parking costs. So the big thing to know is if you have a car and you're relying on the city to house it on the street, that's not our public responsibility. And it may be something that you may have to pay for that private choice at some point in time.
Have a question over here.
Hello, I have a question about how we distribute the demands of land use changes across the entire community. I happen to be in South Corvallis, the Area 10 of the South Corvallis Area Plan on that section of Crystal Lake Drive. And the proposed zoning changes there would create a beacon for for-profit developers to come and try to buy up our properties and to develop them very intensively. We were prepared over a period of, say, 30 or 40 years to pull our weight as we get annexed into the city, because we're in the county now. We were prepared to do our share to provide more housing over a period of time, but the changes that are being proposed in Area 10 of the South Corvallis Area Plan would make us, we'd be in the spotlight, and the possibility of our neighborhood being radically changed in a period of 5 years is really disturbing. And what I'm asking of you now is, can you figure out a way to distribute the need for additional higher density housing over a much broader area so that we can pull our weight? We're happy to do what everybody in the rest of South Corvallis would be doing, but you're asking us to do twice as much as anybody else. And that's the part that's troublesome.
Sure. Yeah, the South Corvallis Area Plan is the place to involve. And the people on Crystal Lake, we have heard you. We've got you recorded. This is probably, I'll let the cat out of the bag. Last night, the community work group that's working on that took in the feedback from the surveys. Well, if they're not online yet, we'll have the surveys on the online shortly so you can see them. But there was concern, obviously, about the up zone along Crystal Lake and a couple other locations. The work group looked at it, had no concern if we chose to go down a down zone route to get it back to where it was. So, but that being said, I know from some of the comments we read, everybody needs to understand low density, your current zoning, your low density residential still is fourplexes and cottage clusters and townhomes and things like that. So, yeah, so this is where the public engagement goes, is in this mapping process. And you did exactly what you're supposed to do. You came, you learned, you provided input. And I think that the next version of this will probably show that. And ultimately, it's going to be the Planning Commission, the council that will make that decision. But that is the planning process, and it is about making that map. That being said, you are just the first area. We have another one kicking off in Southwest, so don't worry, you're not alone.
Thank you, Paul. I'm going to have to cut it off. We can all see this is a hot topic, and I'm glad we got to hear from South Corvallis before the evening was over. When I applied to be on the Committee for Citizen Involvement back in 2000, I told Mayor Berg that this was the committee I wanted to serve on because I believed community involvement was essential to democracy. So I am thrilled by the turnout here, and I was told online turnout was great. And before I turn over the mic back to Annette, as a new member of the league, I want to thank Annette and Peggy for the tremendous work they both do to engage our community here in land use planning and almost everything else. And I would also like to thank the Community Planning Committee, especially our chair, Catherine Bremser, who really pulls everything together to make these happen. And our reliable technical wizard, David Rabinowitz, and he works for multiple volunteer organizations. I would also like to thank our two incredibly dedicated government workers, or public servants might be better name, who are managing the enormous charge of turning the politics and policy and Salem into the changes on the ground on our behalf. It's a hard job, and we don't say thank you very much to these government workers. And I think the job's getting harder, not easier, and, you know, nationally, locally, everywhere. So thank you.
And I'll take volunteers.
So thanks to Barb, because I know that she has spent a tremendous amount of time over the past few months actually putting this program together. And just as a reminder, if you want to talk about any of this, there's going to be an opportunity for discussion next Monday, February 3rd at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and go to the sustainablecorvallis.org website to get the link for that. And I would encourage you all to consider joining the League of Women Voters. We do good work. So thanks again for coming, and I hope you have a great rest of your evening.
Smart.